I want to welcome everybody to this episode of SRLC Presents. Today we have Patrick Lloyd, who will be presenting Trauma Resilience in the Small Town Library. Patrick Lloyd, who is a licensed Master Social Work (MSW), is the first library social worker in Texas and the only helping professional on the City of Georgetown staff. Working with the suburban community, Patrick's work is holistic in nature and includes assessment and referral of patrons with diverse needs, identification and local resource gaps, advocating for expansion of social service capacity within the city, and serving as a liaison between the city staff and local nonprofit agencies. Please welcome Patrick Lloyd.
Thank you, and thank you to the State Library of Michigan for inviting me. I'm sorry that we weren't all together back in April. I've never been to Michigan. I was looking forward to that trip, but there is something to be said for giving talks in your gym jams as well. Hopefully my dogs were just barking right on cue, so hopefully that will be it from them for the rest of the day. So anyway, yeah, so I'm a social worker at a public library here in Texas, in Georgetown, Texas. I've been in this job for November will make 4 years. How I got here and the creation of this job is kind of a long story that if you're curious about, please email me or give me a call. You'll have my contact information at the end of this. I do think it's important to kind of say the obvious that this is a weird time to be giving a talk, I guess period, but particularly a talk on trauma, resilience, and the importance of our libraries and our physical libraries, the buildings. Obviously, many of us are not allowing folks into our buildings right now, or perhaps we're allowing them in a limited capacity. That is what we are doing at my library, despite our escalating COVID data, unfortunately. We are still allowing folks into the building, but it looks very different and folks are not really invited to stay for a very long time, but we'll kind of think about this as we move through. And so with that in mind, I obviously wrote this presentation back in March and April before the pandemic had really hit full force. And I think I actually submitted this originally to Yvette like 4 days before my library shut down. So, I originally wrote this from a perspective of normal. And I've obviously gone back and kind of taken a second look at it and a third look and a fourth look, to be honest with you. And these are some of the questions that are on my mind these days when I think about my work as a social worker and our work as libraries. And we will return to these questions at the end of this talk, but I just wanted to kind of lay them out here at the beginning and ask y'all to think about these questions and think about questions that you have and to hopefully bring those to a Q&A or really I hope more of a discussion towards the end of this presentation, because I think there's a lot of these sorts of questions on all of our minds right now. And personally, I'm only just now starting to feel like I've found my footing in this world, if we can even say that. So I think now is kind of when I'm starting to actually think about how can we start addressing these questions, not just kind of panic questioning myself with these sorts of topics. So goals for this afternoon. We're going to talk about trauma. And before we get into that, let me go ahead and also just say, you can probably guess, but we're going to be talking about some difficult subjects. So please know that I will probably be touching on things like suicide and mental health, poverty, racism, child abuse, things like that. If you need to take a break or mute me for a period of time, please feel free to do so. I think that the first half of this talk is really kind of where most of the dark topics lie. So if you need to take a break, I would say come back in about 25-30 minutes and we should be through most of it. But we are going to be talking about trauma and its effects and its prevalence, how it affects folks and how those effects manifest in our libraries. We'll talk about what I mean by vulnerable patrons and protective factor, and specifically in reference to the library. We'll talk about how our libraries function as protective factors, particularly for vulnerable folks. Why this lens, the trauma-informed lens, is so important, and you'll hear me use the word lens a lot, and I'll explain more about that here in just a second. And of course, we're going to be considering these questions I just talked about as we go, and we'll have time for Q&A, I'm confident. So before we get into the lens metaphor and everything else, let me tell you a little bit about where I'm from. We obviously serve communities, and I think you can't give a talk like this one in a vacuum. We need to understand a little bit, or I want y'all to understand a little bit about where I'm from and how it kind of colors my view of my work and our work in general. So like I said, I'm from Georgetown, Texas. We're about 30 miles north of Austin in the Central Texas area. I like to start with pictures because I think these are valuable when we try and understand the self-image of a community, you know, the story that we tell ourselves about ourselves, if that makes sense. So in the top left over here, this is the San Gabriel River, cuts right through downtown Georgetown. This is a swimming hole park called Blue Hole. It is lovely. It is usually much more crowded than this, and unfortunately it is closed right now because it has been so crowded. Below that, you can see our downtown. We are the county seat, and there is a courthouse smack in the middle of our town square. We are branded as the most beautiful town square in Texas by the state legislature. And this is some of our Victorian architecture. The courthouse is behind the person who ever took that photo. If that person were to look over their left shoulder, they would see our Confederate monument, which is in this top right area of the screen. That monument is still there. There are, as you can probably imagine, frequent, you know, every few years there's a push to remove it. That has again picked up in the past few months as following the killing of George Floyd and the unrest thereafter, but that monument is still there. That is on county land. I'm technically a city employee, so that is not under the purview of our city council, but that discussion is obviously ongoing. Below that, Sun City is a very large, I think there are 15,000 homes in Sun City. It's really a neighborhood. It tends to think of itself like its own city, but it is part of Georgetown, and it is very large. Like I said, lots of people, lots of voters for sure in Sun City. And we'll talk a little bit more about how a large retirement community like that impacts our demographics here in Georgetown as we move on. And of course, we are home to my library, obviously, and we are the, I think, 2018 IMLS National Medal winner, so we got that going for us. Kind of digging into the suburbs. If you're a visual map nerd like I am, you can see here kind of where we are in relation to Austin and Central Texas in general with this map. Like I said, we're kind of at the very tip top of the Austin metro area. We are up to 80,000 people now, which I know this is a small and rural libraries, or was to be a small and rural libraries conference. And I know 80,000 people isn't a very small town. It feels that way to me just because I grew up in Houston. I lived in Austin for 13 years, but then I gave a version of this talk in Montana, and an 80,000 person city in Montana would be the second largest city in the state. So they scoffed at me, as I'm sure some of you are doing right now, but we are a single branch system, library system, if you can call us that, but the city is growing really fast. We are historically rural, majority white, conservative. We just transitioned from being considered by the US Census as rural to suburban as of the 2010 census. So as you can see, we're diversifying, we're aging, we're really much more suburban than we are rural, although there is kind of this community of folks who still think of Georgetown and our county kind of as a whole as rural, which is kind of, there's this push and pull between the desire to remain rural, conservative, Christian, white, etc., with the reality of a diversifying, increasing cost of living, urbanizing area. We don't have an emergency shelter. The only emergency shelter in our county of 585,000 people is a domestic violence shelter in another city. If you are a single man experiencing homelessness who's never been a victim of domestic violence, there is no shelter for you in our county. To that, we've kind of ridden the social service coattails of Austin in the past, and there's kind of two sides to this coin. You know, folks will say to struggling people, you know, why don't you go down to Austin? That's where all the resources are, which, you know, may come from the good of their heart, but there's also in that, why don't you go down to Austin? That's where all the resources are, and leave this community, right? And so we're in this kind of weird geographic spot where we haven't developed much in the way of resources for people other than older adults or children, because I think part of it is because there are those resources in Austin, and part of it is because people just don't our community doesn't value those services, or perhaps you might even say the people that need those services. We do have a 2-year wait for public housing. We have been open essentially, or began opening on May 1st. That includes our library. And this quote down here at the bottom, unfortunately, is from a very powerful person within our city leadership. That is a values statement. That is not a data-based and evidence-based statement. Like I said, there's a 2-year wait list for our public housing. 40% of our public school students receive free or reduced price lunch. I think that quote really sums up part of the trouble that I see in trying to serve vulnerable people and people with trauma histories in this particular community. Okay, so thank you for listening. I feel like that was like the movies where they have like the prologue and the prologue and the prologue. Okay, so I mentioned earlier on that this is really, I really see this work, this kind of trauma-informed work as a lens. And sometimes what I hear from folks is that they kind of want to learn to ride what I call like the trauma-informed bicycle. Or they want to learn it in the same way that we learn CPR. You know, I want to get in and take the course and get the certificate and hang it on my wall and put it on my resume and move on. I got a lot of stuff to do, right? But I don't really like to look at this work as learning to ride a bike. I kind of prefer the metaphor of a lens. Those of you who wear glasses know that lenses don't tell us where to go or what to do or what to say or how to do things. They help us see clearly. And then it's kind of up to us to navigate the world with that more accurate information that we're receiving through the lenses that we're using to help us see. So in this metaphor, I like to think specifically of bifocals. And rather than distance and things close to our face, we're looking at both trauma and protection, or in this case, protective factors, one of which the library is. I hope that today will kind of be, if not the first, perhaps a continuing step in your journey towards becoming trauma-informed. You will not leave this talk with any super specific recommendations. Like I said, this is really to try and help build that lens for you and for your library and for all of us as the library community. And if I was really to boil down the trauma-informed lens completely, it's really about transitioning from a perspective of what's wrong with you to a perspective of what happened to you. So if somebody comes into our library, or if we're out in public or whatever, and we see somebody acting strangely or who is very confrontational, I think it's only natural for most people to go like, what is wrong with you? And when we're thinking about trauma, we kind of want to get away from that, like I said, and think more what happened to you, because often the way that people are behaving is influenced by what they've been through. And so I've asked, if we were in a room together right now, I would ask y'all I usually like a conversational tone when I give talks, and so these webinars feel a little unnatural to me, but if we were in a room, I would ask y'all how you feel about the connectedness of our society right now. And I have asked this question of folks face to face back in, the before time. And it was almost universally met with head shaking, sighing, no words, interestingly. And this was back before COVID-19 and before George Floyd and before 20 million people lost their jobs and everybody started screaming at one another about masks.
Patrick,
So, yes,
I apologize. We seem to be having an audio issue where your voice is fading in and out.
Okay. Let me try. How is it now?
You'd have to go for a little while because you'll be fine for about 4 or 5 seconds and fade out for 3 or 4. It's very slow.
Okay. So let me know if it happens again. So all of which is to say, I suspect that if y'all are similar to the other audiences of information professionals that I've talked to, you're probably thinking that we're not very connected in society right now. And unfortunately, I would agree with that. I think even before our current situation, personally, I saw evidence of that in, school shootings and road rage and internet trolling. And unfortunately, I feel like it's just escalating with the isolation and the stress that we're all under right now. And even back in 2017, there was evidence in this study that you see here that social isolation was increasing. And as y'all can probably guess, that is not good.
It's still doing it. It's very bizarre. And it appears to be getting worse.
Okay, well, I can either power through, or if we can take a short break, I can try and change computers.
Vote from the masses. Power through is my vote. I think we can still hear him. How do we feel? All right, let's keep going.
I'm sorry, I was just putting my headphones back on.
The vote is to keep on going.
Okay, I apologize. I will have to look into using a different computer in the future, I guess. So social isolation is increasing. Obviously, we are all literally, many of us, isolated right now. And that is bad for our mental health and our physical health. Compounding all of this, of course, is the fact that most of us prefer, these technical issues are a good example, right? We all prefer to communicate in person if we can. And so kind of making all of this more difficult is, again, the isolation of this pandemic and the fact that it, even if we're in the same building, oftentimes these days, we are still not communicating face to face with one another. In the previous version of this talk, I talked about how the majority of us had experienced at least one traumatic episode in our lives, and that rate kind of varied from, depending on the study that you were looking at, between 1/2 and 2/3 of people. But I think it's safe to say at this point that we are all, if we had been lucky enough not to have experienced trauma in the past before the pandemic, we have now, unfortunately. So this is something that really touches us all, whether that is personally or through work. I think we all are dealing with trauma in some capacity. So I've used that word several times, right? Trauma. And I suspect that most of y'all are familiar with it at least a little bit just by the fact that you're listening today. But here is the official definition from the Substance Abuse and Mental Health Services Administration. I'll give you just a second to look that over. And I don't disagree with anything here. I do think it kind of falls into that word salad category that a lot of academic definitions tend to fall into. And so you'll hear me do this a few times during this talk. I like to boil things down. And so if we do that, with that word salad definition, we get trauma results from circumstances experienced as harmful or life-threatening with lasting adverse effects. And let me call your attention to a couple phrases here. The first is experienced as. So I think when we think about trauma, a lot of times folks, the first thing that comes to mind are car accidents or combat veterans who experienced an IED blast or something to that effect. And those are absolutely traumas, don't get me wrong. But let me give you another example. I have a cousin who is now an adult and he's doing well. But when he was a kiddo, he was riding in the car with his mom, and they passed the immediate aftermath of a very serious car accident. And he began exhibiting symptoms, which I now, looking back, realize that were consistent with PTSD. He was not a part of that car accident. He only witnessed the aftermath of that car accident, but he experienced it as traumatic. The other thing, like I said, I want to call your attention to is the word lasting adverse effects. These traumas affect us for long periods of time, probably for our entire lives. We can't really get rid of them. I had a therapist talk to me about trauma, and he said, if we treat you with this specific modality, your traumas won't bother you as much anymore, but it's not like you're going to forget them or be hypnotized or something like that. They never really go away, even with trauma-focused treatment. And all of that's to say, trauma changes the brain. We could spend probably the next 2 days talking about the biology of trauma, the neurological effects of trauma, but we don't have that kind of time. And frankly, I don't have the kind of expertise that you would want as far as the biology goes. Suffice to say, trauma changes the brain. It changes the way that we interpret information and process our emotions. And I think perhaps most important to remember is that this is not a choice. This is a thing that happens to us. So when we're interacting with other people, whether they're patrons or our family or our coworkers or whoever, and they're behaving in ways that make us say, what happened to you? Whatever happened, the person didn't choose, and they're not behaving in this way because they're trying to give you a hard time. So types of trauma, I don't want to spend too much time here, but acute, like I said, would be car accident or an explosion, like we talked about. Chronic, as you can see here, would be growing up perhaps without a permanent home or in an abusive home. Complex trauma is really a combination of the two, and this is what I would categorize what we are all going through right now with the combined traumas of ongoing pandemic, perhaps acute loss of a loved one or a job, perhaps chronic stress of the isolation of the situation. Before all of this, I used to use Katrina as an example when talking about complex trauma, because we were talking by and large about a community of color losing their homes, a community that had been historically oppressed and of low socioeconomic status. And I think that's a good example, but unfortunately, I think all of us are beginning to understand what complex trauma is at this point. Historic trauma is specific to a particular group of people. We might think about Jewish folks during the Holocaust, enslaved African folks during our own history. Historic trauma is really about, as you can see here, both what happened in the past and what is still happening. I know this map is kind of hard to read. This is, I think it's a little out of date too, to be honest with you, but the point I'm trying to make with it is that in the teal over here, you have areas of the country with 20+% poverty, and the brown are Native American reservations. And as you can see that there are significant overlap in that. And if y'all know anything about Native American communities, specifically reservations, there are unfortunately very high rates of nasty things like alcoholism and suicide, domestic violence. And that is not a coincidence. That has to do both, as you can see here, with what happened to them and what is continuing to happen. I don't have a slide for it, but I just think it's interesting. There's emerging research on something you might see called intergenerational or transgenerational trauma. And this is the idea that folks or demographics of folks who experience really severe trauma actually pass that down to their descendants. So for example, Holocaust survivors, the grandchildren of Holocaust survivors have higher rates of depression and anxiety than the general population. Again, that's emerging research, and I can't really tell you whether that's due to it being passed down in their genetic codes, or the fact that people who have experienced trauma raise their children differently, or some combination thereof, but I think it's just something to be aware of. So, behavioral responses to trauma, and this is a little bit clinical here, so I apologize. We'll talk about what these things mean in the actual library here in just a second, so bear with me. But when we experience trauma, some of the effects are included on this slide, including emotional dysregulation, like being overwhelmed easily or having a flat affect. That's folks who may come in and they talk like this all the time, and they may seem a little bit sleepy or numb, as you can see here. This is something I think that I'm already seeing in my coworkers, to be honest with you, and myself, if I'm being honest. I think it's important as we move through this to understand that we're not only talking about our patrons anymore. Like I said, we're all experiencing a trauma right now, so we're kind of all in this boat together. So I'm seeing coworkers kind of be a little bit snippier with one another. I'm definitely noticing myself being snippier, especially when I'm driving. These days, substance abuse, definitely something we see in our libraries from folks who have experienced trauma. Self-destructive behaviors, you may see folks who, I would categorize substance abuse as potentially self-destructive, but you may also see folks who self-harm or...
Hold on.
I'm sorry, go ahead. Okay. Who self-harm, or sometimes folks will pull out their own hair. Sleep disturbances is a big one for libraries in general. I know during the months of March and April, I think if I got 5 hours of sleep in a night, that was a good night of sleep for me at that time. When we talk about folks whose living situations are more difficult than mine, sleep becomes really tough, especially if home isn't safe or if I don't have a home. So we see a lot of folks dealing with sleep issues in our libraries. Somatization is something when a person's body will exhibit physical symptoms of a medical issue that is not medical in nature. So in my library, we have a patron who has been having a hard time for a very long time, and part of his challenge is significant mental health issues. And one of the things that he does when he feels that other people are too close to him is that he coughs. And even before this pandemic, his coughing got so bad that our legal department called us and said, we're getting so many complaints about this person. We can't allow him in the library until he takes a TB test. And he agreed to do that, and it was negative. So my educated guess is that his symptoms were somatic in nature. However, especially these days, we always need to assume that folks with medical symptoms are experiencing those symptoms from an organic cause, but they may not be. And then, of course, cognitive challenges, definitely another thing that I am seeing everywhere, again, including my coworkers. And we're having a lot of trouble keeping up. We've lost all of our volunteers, and they did a huge amount of our check-ins and shelving. and we're having trouble keeping up without those volunteers. And we're also having trouble, I think, because folks aren't sleeping well. They're feeling emotionally dysregulated, and our employees are experiencing cognitive challenges as a result of the current stress and the current trauma that we're all undergoing. Things are getting misshelved, things are being mislabeled. And so unfortunately, I think that's another thing that we can anticipate moving forward. So all of this, I mean, illustrates that I think we can expect these sorts of behavioral responses to increase both in number of incidences we see and unfortunately in severity in our buildings when we allow people back into them, and just in society in general. I know it's anecdotal and probably not, we wouldn't use it in a research methods class, but certainly if you turn on CNN or Facebook or whatever, we're seeing videos of people lashing out and behaving in ways that perhaps we didn't see quite as often. And those are happening, it seems like, more often at least. So some examples of what those responses really look like in the library. And of course, we're talking about drinking or using substances in the building. And like I just talked about, confrontations are blowing up, or disputes between patrons blowing up. And I think if I back up just a little bit, if you look at this red area of the bell curve, if you think about the fact that more and more people are probably existing in this red area now than were before, you can see how, that person's in my spot, or that person, I was going to check that book out, or whatever. All those little things that probably caused small headaches for us before may cause larger headaches moving forward. Again, we're going to see continuing issues with sleeping, I think. The medical symptoms, which are obviously are higher concern these days than they were before. Folks alarmed upon our approaching them. This is especially important when we talk. I skipped over on accident hypervigilance over here. Hypervigilance is something that we see a lot in folks who have PTSD diagnoses. This is folks who are startled easily, folks who may be looking over their shoulder a lot. Kind of the stereotype is that combat veterans who may have PTSD are hypervigilant. Kind of a car backfiring may set them off. We heard about this recently with July 4th and fireworks. I do a whole hour-long talk on how to physically approach patrons who have experienced trauma, because there is a kind of a technique. You want to make sure that, especially if you're assuming that everybody has a trauma history, that you're approaching for folks from the front and you're not surprising them and you're kind of waving at them and getting their attention. You're not tapping them on the shoulder from behind or something like that. And then as far as those cognitive issues, you'll see this when our patrons become confused when they're asked simple questions. So if you're asking somebody for their phone number and they have a hard time remembering it, or perhaps they ask you the same question multiple times. I'm sure we get this a lot, both from people who are just experiencing typical cognitive decline due to aging. We see that a lot in my community because, like I said, we have that large retirement community, and our median age in Georgetown is 47. I forgot to mention that. Texas as a whole is 34, so we are a much older community. I also see this a lot when sometimes I will meet with or talk to on the phone patrons that I have talked to before, and they won't remember having spoken to me, and you might attribute that to mental health issues or substance use, but I kind of chalk all those things up to the trauma that folks have experienced. So a lot of this is kind of grim stuff, and obviously it affects a lot of people, but why do I need to know it? Well, like I said, it does affect a lot of people. I would say all of us at this point. These are some statistics. We won't dwell on these too long, but suffice to say that a lot of people, a lot of us go through very difficult things and have in our past. 1 in 10 of us will have a drug use disorder in our life. Our suicide rate, unfortunately, has been climbing for a very long time. And I expect it will do so for the foreseeable future as a result of our current events. Same for drug use, alcohol use, overeating, and the subsequent health consequences of that. If y'all are familiar with the term deaths of despair that's been written about in recent years, I think that, as you can see, those have been increasing. And I think that we can anticipate they will continue to do so again as our situation right now continues to deteriorate. Deaths due to complications from pregnancy rose 200% over the last 20 or so years, which is mind-blowing to me. And this is even worse for women of color, for Black and Native women. It's worse. And over here on the right, we can look at the data from opioid overdoses in Michigan have been rising for 20 years. And again, I expect those will continue to do so for the foreseeable. And Michigan is not alone in this. I have used versions of this chart from Texas and Louisiana and Arkansas and many other states, unfortunately. So like I said, this is important stuff for us to talk about because we serve the public and the public is struggling. And again, more mental health statistics. Just briefly, if you've got 100 people in your building at any given time, you can assume 20 of those people are currently experiencing a diagnosable mental illness. And of those, 4 are experiencing serious mental illness, meaning that it's really getting in the way of their day-to-day life. Excuse me while I drink some water. Any mental illness can get in, can limit your functionality on a day-to-day basis, but when we're talking about serious mental illness, we're really talking about things like schizophrenia, major depression, bipolar, things like that. Affects kids, and most people are not receiving the kind of treatment that they need in this area. So, like I said, the front end of this talk was kind of loaded with the sad stuff. So we've kind of pushed through, and I appreciate y'all sticking with me, especially through the audio issues. I'm sorry about that. I'm a dog person, and I suspect some of you are dog people, and I just think this is a good time to have kind of a palate cleanser. So here are my dogs who have been mercifully quiet so far during this talk. They were watching me cut up some sort of melon. They love melon. So anyway, these are my dogs, looking very well behaved. They are not usually. So kind of moving into the second part of this talk. Remember, like I said, think of this lens like bifocals. And so if we think about trauma as being one of the pieces of that bifocal lens, the other part is protection. And this is kind of what we can do about it section. And I'll be honest, this is also the section that troubles me a bit, because how do we do this without access to our buildings? And so I invite y'all to think about that question kind of as we move through this. So for just a moment, when you hear that phrase, vulnerable patron, who do you think of? And so this is not an exhaustive list, but I think of folks of low socioeconomic status. Like I said, in my community, it's really important that we're thinking about older folks, because they comprise a huge portion of our population. About a third of Georgetown's population is over 60. Anybody with physical health, mental health issues, folks experiencing homelessness, people of color, the LGBTQ community, victims of domestic violence and sexual assault. I do not ask patrons when I kind of sit down and have an interview with them. I typically do not ask them outright if they have been victims of domestic violence. However, about 16% of them, that's about 1 in 6, volunteer that they have been. So that's the floor in my library. So we know that there are a lot of DV victims and sexual assault victims coming into our libraries. And then, of course, we're talking about people with trauma, who have experienced trauma. So I think that they are definitely vulnerable. And then the ACEs study, Adverse Childhood Experiences, is from the 90s. If you're interested in what I'm talking about here, I definitely encourage you to go take a look at the ACEs study. You can just literally Google ACEs study and it'll pop up. Like I said, it's from back in the 90s. It talks a lot about, it was kind of the first big serious study to explain that kind of the obvious looking back. You know, if you have a difficult childhood, a traumatic childhood, you're more likely to have a difficult adulthood. The more traumas that you experience as a child, the greater likelihood that you will have things like, it's kind of hard to see in this chart over here, but fractures, PTSD, STDs, diabetes, all sorts of difficulties in your life. So like I said, if this is an area of interest for you, please seek out the ACEs study. You can feel free to email me about it and we can chat more. If we were in the same room together, I would actually ask y'all to complete the ACEs questionnaire. It's only 10 questions. You can do it yourself. I think it can be helpful to do with library staff people because, and I ask folks to participate and close their eyes so that I can kind of take stock of folks' answers anonymously, but you can do the questionnaire with library staff and figure out how many traumas there are in your library. And we're talking often about people who have, I hope, decent jobs at the library, who have some level of education and some level of stability in their lives. And often there's a significant trauma history even among that population. So when we extrapolate that out to our patrons, we can assume that they have had an even more difficult time. So when I think about vulnerable patrons, this is kind of the definition that I think of. And basically it's that they are folks whose basic needs are not being met by the existing resources in our community. And people come to our libraries for all sorts of different reasons, obviously. I mean, they come at books, number one, and that information, entertainment. They come to meet friends, check their email, come to use our meeting space usually, and to attend our activities or attend them these days online. These are a few of the things that we do at our library. We did, and hopefully, and we will do again, live music. And we're not a quiet library. That's part of the reason why I'm talking to you from my house today. We have live music and video game tournaments, and we have, I have to phrase this correctly, an animal petting zoo for adults only, which is one of my favorite things that we do over here on the right. So take a moment and think about why vulnerable people visit us. So usually when I ask this question, folks will come up with a list of things like this. Heat and AC, obviously super important. Up in Michigan, I suspect the heating part is the most important piece of that. Down here in Texas, it's the AC. We are in the midst of a brutal heat wave in Central Texas. It was 102 degrees last night at 8 p.m. It is hot. So the AC is really important for vulnerable people who may not have access to it outside of public buildings. That is at the top of my mind right now, thinking about that heat wave and the fact that people are, only really able to spend very limited amount of time in our building, and that in and of itself is a danger because of COVID. Water, safety, a place to just be. Sometimes folks will wonder what I mean by just be, or why would folks need a place to just be? And I would say, if somebody needs to come to a public library to just be, that means, to me, that means that they can't just be where they live, because where they live is not safe. I think this is a helpful time to, again, reflect back on that. What happened to you? Remember, we're trying to switch over from what's wrong with you to what happened to you. And the example that pops into my mind when I think about a place to just be are single parents who come in. In our community, we see this a lot with single moms. And they'll come in with 2 or 3 small children, and mom will sit down either in the lobby and kind of take a nap, or maybe get on the computer, and the kids kind of run around and cause a headache for our staff. But when I see that and I think about what happened to you, what that tells me is that is a parent who can't just sit and rest or check her email or apply to a job in her living situation. Vulnerable people come to our libraries in part because it's a place where they can form healthy relationships, friendships with folks, either staff people or other patrons. Increasingly, as evidenced by the fact that I exist in this job, is that people come for social services and referrals, either from library staff social workers, or maybe a community partner. And of course, there are some folks who just have nowhere else to go. And if the weather is bad, that becomes really important. All of that said, I think it's also really important for us to remember that vulnerable folks visit us for all the same reasons who privileged folks visit us. The information, entertainment, books, checking their email, activities. We have something. It's not uncommon for us to have people experiencing homelessness attend our Bible studies or our art openings, or that sort of stuff. And so I think this is really important when we think about trust. Oh, we're not there yet. We'll get to trust in a minute. So it's really important for us to think about, and I think respect why and how vulnerable people are using the library. I think there's really sometimes an inclination on the part of good-hearted staff people to see somebody who's obviously struggling and to think like, oh, you need to get out there and apply for a job or talk to a social worker or get on some mental health meds. And that's probably true. But if that person is actually using the library today to check their email and have a cup of coffee with their friend, and we approach them and say, hey, would you like the number for a mental health evaluation? They may not come back to our library tomorrow, and we'll get to why I think that's so important, especially for us serving smaller communities here in just a second. So thinking about all of these things here, both on the left and the right, that our libraries provide for folks, I think that the library serves as a protective factor for all people, to be sure, but particularly for vulnerable folks. So take a minute and read these, again, this kind of academic word salad definition. Sorry, I just don't like reading things when people have them right in front of them. So protective factors, again, to kind of boil this down a little bit more simply, are the relationships, tools, things in our lives that hopefully keep us out of traumatic situations in the first place. And they also help us bounce back from traumas, from challenges, generally speaking. So a decent job, access to transportation, growing up in a two-parent household, having healthy food on the table, those are all protective factors. The friend who comes over to your house with pizza and a bottle of wine when you go through a breakup is a protective factor. The team or the activity that you were involved in high school that kept you from smoking pot, that was a protective factor. So when we think about vulnerable people, I think that our libraries, due to all of the things that we just went through that they provide, serve as protective factors. So if y'all took psychology, like intro psychology in high school or college, then you'll recognize this triangle here on the right as Maslow's hierarchy of needs. And Abraham Maslow was a psychologist back in the day. And basically, this theory says that in order for each of us to reach the top of this pyramid and to what he called self-actualize or reach our full potential, we have to kind of start at the bottom and work our way up. And you can see that if we follow it from the bottom up, our libraries provide a ton of these resources for folks. Water, warmth, rest, you can check all those off. Some libraries even provide food. I spoke to some folks in Arkansas who are actually feeding patrons. My library doesn't feed folks, but we do have a community partner that hands out brown bag lunches 5 days a week in the parking lot across from our library. Safety and security, most of our libraries are safe and secure most of the time. We do perhaps don't offer them from our staff or facilitate them ourselves, but I think that the environment of our physical libraries, and even these days, in the way that we are trying to connect people virtually, again, in my mind, I'm thinking specifically of our older patrons who may not have access to a lot of other people right now. You know, we help facilitate relationships and we introduce people to new friends. Prestige and accomplishment is something that maybe is not as common, but, you know, I think about my library and I used to think like, we don't really do that. But then I was like, you know what, we have art shows, and we have had art shows for older folks. We have had art shows for artists with disabilities. And then I thought about our volunteers, and a lot of our volunteers are older, and perhaps they're retired or they've had to give up work in the recent past, and we really provide an avenue for them to continuing to feel a sense of accomplishment. So I think we need to keep these things in mind when we think about all of the kind of stuff that our libraries offer beyond just books and music and movies and that sort of thing. And then self-actualization, I'd say we're kind of all on our own. If we can get people to that part of the model, then we're doing pretty good. And so considering all of the things that we're able to provide, back when I was still able to work with folks face to face, and still when I email with them or talk to them on the phone, my first goal when I work with, or maybe even choose not to work with somebody, is that they come back to the library tomorrow or these days, that they continue to utilize our services on an ongoing basis. Because if I get nosy with them, this is something I think that we see in smaller communities a lot, right? Nosy people, maybe they're being nosy out of the goodness of their heart, but rub some people the wrong way. If I'm nosy with somebody, or I piss them off, or they start to feel obligated to have a conversation with me about their mental health every time they come into the library, they're probably less likely to come back. And because I serve a community, and I suspect a lot of y'all serve communities that don't have a ton of resources, they need to keep coming back, because if they quit coming to the library, then they don't have access to all of these resources here on the right side on this pyramid. Because again, we're a single branch system. And if they don't come up to our library, there is no other library for them to go to. And as I said earlier, you know, this is all about trust. And I think that all of us know just from our experience that people trust libraries. We know that the Pew Research Center demonstrated that a few years ago. And I think a lot of us probably also know that it can be really difficult to earn the trust of a vulnerable person. You know, a lot of folks had either through their perception or in actuality have felt wronged by institutions and people throughout their lives. A lot of these, when I'm thinking specifically of folks who have been having a hard time for a long time. People experiencing homelessness, people with mental illness, people who have been poor for their whole lives. They may be very angry and distrustful of law enforcement and schools and hospitals and caseworkers and churches and immigration and you name it. And so even though a library, I think, is different from all of those other institutions, you can see how somebody who has had negative interactions with all of those other institutions might be distrustful of our libraries, at least initially. So it can be, like I said, it can take a really long time to earn the trust of these folks. On the flip side, it can also be really easy to lose that trust. And let me give you an example. So we have a patron at our library, again, having a hard time for a long time. I met him really early after I got hired. I think it was my second or third week. And we had a chat, a decent chat. I wasn't able to, completely address his problem at the time, but it was productive. And after that, we would say hello now and then in the lobby or what have you, but we didn't have any kind of sit down talk one-on-one for a few years. And then about 2 years later, he came to me and he said, can I talk to you? And I said, sure. And unfortunately, I don't have an office. And so finding a private, confidential space is always a struggle. So me and this patron went up to our classroom on the second floor of our library and sat down, and he began to tell me what seemed to be a story that was going to be about his own trauma history. And as he was beginning that story, unfortunately, a coworker kind of rapped on the door and came in to grab a cord or something from that classroom. And this patron, who is kind of an ornery fella, stood up and walked out. And I went, and he's older, so he was taking the elevator downstairs, and I went down the stairs and caught him in the lobby. And I don't know what I was going to say to him, but before I could say anything, he stuck a finger in my face and said, "That was a shitty thing to do to a person." And I said to him, "I agree." And he left, and we haven't really spoken since. Now, he continues, well, of course, pre-pandemic, he was continuing to use the library as he had before. I did not approach him, and I have not approached him and said, "Hey, can we talk about what happened?" Or I want to apologize, or "Please don't stick your finger in my face," or whatever, any number of those things that I might say to him if he were a family member or a neighbor or someone else in my life, because I'm trying to respect the way that he is using the library and the way that he is not currently using me as a social worker. Because again, if I further damage whatever trust he may have in me, or which maybe isn't any at all, but he still trusts the library. But if I then push him to a point where he starts to distrust the library, he loses access to all of those resources that we were just talking about. And again, I think all of this stuff, but particularly that trust, is so important for those of us serving smaller communities. Because if you don't have an emergency shelter or easily accessible mental health resources, or just welcoming public spaces, again, for people who just need a place to just be, and we're kind of jumping on people who we perceive as needing help, and they start to feel like, "Get off of me, I'm just here to check my email and apply for a job, or rent DVDs with my kids, like I don't want to talk about this right now," they're going to come see us less. And when we lack all of these things here on these bullets on the left, that's a problem. We want folks to come back. And so I think it's really important that we earn their trust and try and maintain that trust as much as possible, and really respect the fact that folks may be vulnerable, but they may benefit from talking to a social worker or a mental health professional. But if they're not there to do that today, and we try and make them do that, they may not come see us tomorrow. We want them to come back, because our libraries are one of the only places where a lot of people can interact with the entire community. I think this is good for everybody, right? I think more and more when we talk about social isolation, people feeling disconnected, and really, in my opinion, the breakdown of the social fabric, there are, in my opinion, really only two places where everybody can come hang out together for free. And of course, we can't do that right now, but sometime in the future when we can, I think it's us as libraries and parks. I haven't yet to think of any place else like that. Maybe if we have a free museum or something like that in our community, but again, then you start to get into kind of like vulnerable people might not feel comfortable coming into a museum because they may perceive it as kind of a hoity-toity place. So I think there's a lot of privilege and responsibility that comes with that when we think about the fact that libraries and parks are really unique in the things that we offer our communities as a whole and our individual patrons. The flip side of the slide that I showed earlier, talking about how social isolation increases risk, same study says that social connection reduces risk. So again, this is something that is, I think, unique for libraries, and gives us what did they say in Spider-Man, with great power comes great responsibility. I think it gives us a great amount of responsibility. And again, this is where all those questions that I talked about right at the outset of this talk kind of pop into my mind, because I'm like, God, we have so much, you know, this is a real honor to work at a library, but like, how do we continue this kind of work given our current situation? And this is so important for me because I think all of us probably had life-changing experiences with libraries at some point in our past, and that's what led us to work in them. So libraries can be life-changing for everybody that walks through our doors, but for vulnerable folks, our libraries, both our buildings, the relationships that are cultivated within them can be life-saving. So again, this is a really tough time for people, everybody, generally. It's certainly tough for vulnerable people, but it's also like, how do we keep that up? Can we keep that up? Is something that's definitely on my mind right now. So sometimes at this point, some of y'all or other folks who have been through versions of this talk may be thinking, you know, that's not what libraries are for, and making a face like this, or at least internally making a face like this. And I hear you. You know, I think when folks say this and you boil it down, what they're getting at is that they're saying that libraries are about books, right? They're a place for intellectually curious people to kind of come investigate the human condition through the timelessness of literature, right? And that's great, and I agree. But when we talk about libraries being about books, I think it's also important and I believe that our libraries are essential, but I think it's also important to acknowledge that books are no longer essential to libraries. For so many of us and many of our patrons, including vulnerable patrons, books, movies, media, research, all of these things are available in our pockets these days. And so if we want to say that libraries are about books, but books are no longer necessary in physical form, why do we have our buildings? You know, and I know this is a weird time to be saying this because I'm sure a lot of us are very nervous about budget cuts. So it was a lot easier to give this spiel kind of 6 months ago. But, you know, if the physical books are no longer essential to libraries, why do we have our buildings? Couldn't we just sell the buildings and save a lot of money? Well, my argument is that libraries aren't really about books, they're about people. That's probably not a surprise to any of you based on things that I've said already. So when we're talking about libraries being about people, and we're talking about patrons who've experienced trauma or who are vulnerable, who come into our libraries and they have questions whose answers lie outside the walls of our library rather than within it. I think that there's a really common and good-hearted struggle on the part of us as library staff when people come in and they say, you know, it's like an onion, it's like peeling back an onion, right? Somebody says, oh, can I get some help printing this job application? And it's like, oh, sure. And that'll be 10 cents. Oh, I don't have it today. You know, I got kicked out of my house because my mom's boyfriend blew up. And all of a sudden you started out printing something for somebody, and all of a sudden you're having a conversation about poverty and domestic violence, right? And this probably happens to a lot of them. And when you encounter a situation like that, I think there's this very human urge to give that person something, right? They obviously need a lot of things, right? They need a safe place to sleep, they need money, they need a job. I want to give them something to address those needs. But what I would argue is that oftentimes, not all the time, but I would go as far as saying most of the time, struggling folks really need someone more than they need something, right? If people have been struggling for a long time, they probably know the social service resources available in your community better than you do. So you telling them to call the food pantry or the job help center, they've probably already done that. So try and think about what is it that this person is not getting that they need. And often that's someone. And that may be the relationship with you, but I want to be really specific with this. And that sometimes when I talk about how the fact that the relationship that you have with a patron may be the only healthy connection that person has. And it can sometimes sound like, oh, I have to be friends with this patron, or I have to be this patron's caseworker or their therapist or whatever. And I want to be explicit that that's not what I'm suggesting. I don't do therapy. I don't do case management as a social worker. But what I am saying is that for people who are vulnerable, people who experience trauma, and people who have been marginalized to the outskirts of society, who have very few healthy connections to other people, the relationship that you may have with them as their library staff person, and I mean that in a typical sense, may be their healthiest connection to society. And to give you an example of what I'm talking about, we have another patron who's been having a hard time for a long time, and he is another prickly person. And we have a very warm-hearted person on staff, and she happens to be a hugger. And I certainly wouldn't advocate everybody hugging patrons. I don't, but she happens to be somebody who does. And she was talking to this patron, and he said, "It's my birthday." And our staff person said, "Oh my God, it's your birthday, happy birthday," and gave him a hug. Something that I think, many of us would absolutely say happy birthday. Some of us would hug that person, right? It's a very small gesture. It's probably something that our staff person did not give a second thought when she went home that evening. But a day or two later, the patron came back and gave the staff person a thank you card and thanking her for wishing him a happy birthday. And so I would ask all of you if you have ever felt compelled to buy a thank you card for someone who just wished you a happy birthday. And I have yet to meet anybody else who has done that. And so then I would also ask you to consider the circumstances in the life of someone who did feel compelled to buy a thank you card for someone who wished them a happy birthday. And so when I talk about the relationship that you have with a patron, I'm not saying be their friend or their therapist, but for people who have very, very few or no connections to society, and again, thinking about how that social isolation is a massive risk factor, we need to pay attention and, in my opinion, really honor the fact that we may be that only connection for some people. So again, it's not our job. And this is a statement that I agree with, but in a society where our fabric feels like it's falling apart more and more, I would argue that it's also not the job of public schools to feed our kids for free or for very small amounts of money 10 times a week. And I don't think it's really the job of jails to provide mental health services, but that's a huge part of what they do. And I used to use, this example feels more and more strange, but I don't think emergency rooms were designed to treat the common flu, but they will do so if you are really sick with the regular flu, because it's their responsibility. And I think that it's not our job to do all this stuff, but it is our responsibility. So kind of winding down, earlier I talked about how some people think about the trauma-informed lens as not as a lens, but they think of it like a bicycle. And I think of it as a lens, and I also think of kind of the trauma work generally as less like riding a bike and more like gardening. I like this metaphor I was an English major in undergraduate, you can't tell. I like metaphor. But I like to think of it like gardening because if y'all garden, then gardening takes a lot of time. Almost anybody can do it. You can be an expert gardener, you can be president of your gardening club, But there are always variables that come along in gardening that kind of knock you off your comfortable pedestal, right? You might have been gardening for 25 years, but you still got to keep track of your soil pH. There may be a drought, it may flood, there may be a summer where the bugs are really bad and you have to adjust for that. So you're never really done gardening. And I would argue that you're never really done with becoming more and more trauma informed. This is really similar if you've done any training in cultural competence or cultural humility. It's kind of the same concept. You're never really finished. And if you think you're finished, then that's probably when you need to go get some more training, because you're never really done. I also really like gardening because, plants can grow anywhere. If you throw some seeds in a field, leave them be, some of those seeds will sprout. But if you really want plants to thrive, then we need to help take care of them. And I think that that's a really powerful way, for me at least, to think about serving our patrons, especially our vulnerable folks. So now what? And I apologize because this probably feels really tacked on, and to be honest with you, it's because it is. This talk is really designed to kind of begin a conversation or a series of thoughts in y'all's heads. The good news is that I give an hour presentation on the information contained within this slide, and I'm giving it next week at this exact same time, so I hope y'all will come and join me if you can. I think I'm running a little short on time. I want to make sure that we have time for Q&A, but if you Google community mental health services providers in Michigan, you will be able to find out who your your local provider is, and one of the things that they can offer you is mental health first aid training. That is pretty much what it sounds like. If you Google mental health first aid, you will learn more. It is typically low cost and is a really good first step in trying to kind of broaden your library's thinking about the issues that we're talking about today. Partnering with service providers is super, super important, regardless of how small your community may be. Sometimes those providers may not be formal. They may be Mrs. Johnson from First United Methodist, who puts hygiene packets together for folks who are experiencing homelessness. So I really encourage everybody, but particularly those of us who serve smaller communities, to think about local providers outside the box of just formal 501c3 nonprofits. Also really encourage folks to attend task forces, alliances, coalitions. You may hear them called different things, but basically groups of folks, often professionals, who get together and talk about these kinds of issues, and depending on your community, it could be any number of things. Here in my county, we have a mental health task force. We have one on children and families. So I encourage you to seek those out and attend them regularly, because my experience has been that those groups are usually really excited to hear from libraries, because they understand that the folks that they serve are often also frequent library patrons. Narcan is an anti-opioid overdose medication. You can probably get it for free. I can help you with that if you like. It is easy to use. We have it in our building. I carry it in my work backpack with me and keep carrying it in my truck. Thankfully, I've not had to use it to this point, but other library staff people have in other places. Trauma Informed Oregon has some really useful models, I think, for thinking through all of this stuff and how to progress. And then, of course, the topics that I'm talking about today, I think, are things that we need to talk about, both as a national library community, but also within our individual branches. And I think making these normal topics of conversation are really important. Real briefly over here on the right, these are 5 principles of trauma-informed care. We're not providing care in libraries, so we might call it trauma-informed customer service. I will let y'all look at that yourselves. I like to add cultural, historic, and gender considerations, and I'll tell you just what I mean by that. So here in Texas, the Texas Rangers are a thing, historic law enforcement agency. There's Walker Texas Ranger TV show. There's the Texas Rangers baseball team. People generally enjoy the Texas Rangers, and there may be historical fiction written about them. But in reality, the Texas Rangers also have a long history of violence towards people of Mexican descent, both on the Mexico side of the border and the Texas side. So as a library who's trying to invite our entire community to come utilize our services, if we were to have an author event with someone who had written a fun historical fiction novel about the Texas Rangers, that would, in my opinion, be an unwelcoming thing to do to our Latino neighbors. So I think that that would be a trauma-informed way of thinking about cultural and historic stuff. So bringing us back to these questions, losing access to the building, that is a huge loss. Is there anything that we can do to mitigate the consequences of that loss? What do we need to do as a library who we're watching the killing of George Floyd and other Black people in our communities? We had somebody die in our community named Javier Ambler last year. It's recently come to light. How can our library become actively anti-racist? What can we do now, and what can we continue to do when this pandemic is hopefully over? How can we help people feel connected? Again, we've talked a lot about why that's important. I think it's really important that we're taking care of staff right now, and taking care of one another. I will try and remember to post an article I wrote on this topic here in the chat in just a minute for Public Libraries Online last month. Again, huge loss when we lose the building. How can we still be a protective factor? How are we still a protective factor? And can we build on that right now? Financial assistance is a huge, huge need. I think it will only get worse. One of the things that we're doing is inviting folks to send us their resumes, and about a half a dozen of our staff people, myself included, are basically proofreading resumes because we can't do it in person. We're doing it via email. And also one of the things that I do is compile a list of the social services in my community and what's being offered and what is not being offered, because it's kind of slowed down now, but initially when we first went into lockdown, I was changing rapidly. And when I was trying to get accurate information to our staff and to our city as a whole, to make sure that we were telling people accurate information about what was going on. And you can really do that, I think, through, if they're a formal agency, you can do that pretty easily through social media or their website. But again, always remember to reach out, especially for those of us in smaller communities, reaching out to those folks who we just happen to know work with vulnerable people just out of the goodness of their heart, and figure out what they're doing as well. So I'm sorry to kind of tear through the end of this. Please feel free to contact me. Please feel free to join my talk next week, which will be much narrower in scope on community partnerships. And I'm happy to take your questions.
We do have time for questions, so if you have any for Patrick, please feel free to either mic up or throw them in chat. All right. Oh, we do have a question in chat. That would be a question for me. You can find information on these if you go to michigan.gov/libraryce, and you can find a link to our list of upcoming events, which includes information on this one. These are open to everybody. All right, we've been having quiet groups lately. I don't think we have any questions. Thank you so much, Patrick. And we will see you again next week. We're excited to have you back.
Yeah, I'll be here, or you know what I mean.
We'll all be here in some way.
Yeah.
Thank you again.
Yeah, of course. Thank y'all.